Picture this. You're standing in the marble hallway of Neuschwanstein Castle in 1886, your heart pounding as you hear the king's footsteps echoing from the chamber above. The sound is deliberate, predatory, accompanied by the soft whisper of silk against stone. You're 19 years old, recently hired as a personal attendant to King Ludwig II of Bavaria, and what you've witnessed in these past weeks has shattered every fairy tale you ever believed about royal courts. The other servants warned you in hushed whispers about the king's special requirements, but nothing could have prepared you for the reality of serving a monarch whose obsession with beautiful young men had consumed not just his sanity, but the entire Bavarian treasury. Your hands tremble as you adjust the golden candelabra in the corridor, knowing that any moment now, the king will summon you to his private chambers. The castle that tourists today admire as a romantic fairy tale was, in reality, a labyrinth of secret passages and hidden rooms designed for one purpose: to satisfy the twisted desires of a king who had lost all connection to reality. Behind the ornate walls and stunning architecture lay a network of tunnels that connected the king's bedroom to the servants' quarters, allowing Ludwig to move unseen through his castle like a predator stalking his prey. The footsteps stop directly above you, and you know your time has come. Tonight, like so many nights before, you will descend into the underground passages that honeycomb the castle's foundation, passages that no guidebook will ever mention, to serve a king whose appetite for young male flesh had become as legendary as his architectural obsessions. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of royal excess. It's the story of how absolute power can transform love into obsession, beauty into a weapon, and a fairy tale castle into a prison for the young men trapped within its walls. The name Ludwig II might conjure images of romantic castles and artistic patronage, but his true legacy lies buried in the testimonies of servants who survived his reign of terror and in the bodies of those who didn't. Let's start with the man who would become known as the Mad King of Bavaria. Ludwig wasn't born evil. In fact, his early years showed remarkable promise. When he ascended to the throne at just 18 years old in 1864, many Bavarians believed they were witnessing the dawn of a golden age. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and possessed an artistic sensibility that seemed to promise a reign of cultural flourishing. He funded opera houses, supported composers like Richard Wagner, and dreamed of creating architectural marvels that would make Bavaria the envy of Europe. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls, and by 1869, something had fundamentally broken inside the young king's mind. Maybe it was the constant pressure to marry and produce an heir when his deepest desires lay elsewhere. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only person in a kingdom of 4 million who could never be contradicted, never be challenged, never be told he was wrong. Or maybe it was what happened during his brief engagement to his cousin Sophie, when he discovered that the very idea of intimate contact with a woman filled him with such revulsion that he would rather die than consummate a marriage. The engagement was broken off after 2 years, officially to incompatible temperaments, but the truth was far more scandalous. Ludwig had confided to his diary that the thought of touching Sophie intimately made him physically ill, that her feminine presence in his private chambers felt like a violation of something sacred within him. He wrote extensively about his preference for the company of beautiful young men, describing their bodies in language so explicit that his handlers later burned most of these writings to protect the royal reputation. It was around this time that Ludwig began what he euphemistically called his aesthetic appreciation of male beauty. The king started personally interviewing all male servants before they could be hired, ostensibly to ensure they met the high standards of the royal household. In reality, these interviews were opportunities for Ludwig to evaluate potential victims for his increasingly depraved appetites. The selection process was elaborate and humiliating. Young men seeking employment at the castle were required to strip completely naked, while Ludwig examined them like livestock. He would circle around them, commenting on their physique, their skin tone, their hair texture, making notes in a leather-bound book that he kept locked in his private safe. Those who met his aesthetic standards were hired immediately, regardless of their qualifications for actual work. Those who didn't were dismissed without explanation. Hans Müller was one of those who caught the king's eye. Born in a small village outside Munich, Hans came to the castle seeking work to support his widowed mother and 3 younger sisters. He was 17, with the kind of lean, athletic build that came from years of farm labor, and possessed the fair hair and blue eyes that Ludwig found irresistible. During his interview, the king spent nearly an hour examining Hans's body, touching him in ways that the young man later described as like being evaluated for slaughter. Hans was hired as a personal valet, a position that came with private quarters in the servants' wing and access to the king's private chambers. What he didn't know was that his room had been specially prepared for Ludwig's convenience. Hidden behind what appeared to be solid wood paneling was a secret passage that connected directly to the king's bedroom, allowing Ludwig to visit his servants without being seen by guards or other staff members. The first visit came on Hans's 3rd night at the castle. He was awakened by the sound of his panel sliding open, and before he could react, King Ludwig stepped into his room wearing only a silk robe that left little to the imagination. The king's presence filled the small space like a poisonous cloud, bringing with it the scent of expensive perfumes and something else, something predatory that made Hans's skin crawl. "Your Majesty," Hans stammered, trying to cover himself with his thin blanket. "I wasn't expecting." "Silence," Ludwig commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. "You are here to serve your king in whatever capacity I require. Tonight, that service extends beyond your daytime duties." What happened next has been documented in Hans's own words, written in a letter he sent to his mother shortly before his mysterious disappearance from the castle. The letter was discovered decades later, hidden in the walls of his family's cottage during renovation work. In it, Hans described being forced to submit to acts so degrading, so violative of human dignity, that even reading about them more than a century later is almost unbearable. Ludwig's appetites weren't just sexual, they were psychological. He derived pleasure not just from physical domination, but from the complete destruction of his victim's sense of self-worth. He would force young men to dress in elaborate costumes, sometimes as characters from operas, sometimes as mythological figures, and always in ways that emphasized their vulnerability and his power over them. The king had an entire wardrobe of costumes designed specifically for these encounters. Silk tunics that left the wearer exposed, elaborate headdresses that obscured vision and hearing, and restraints disguised as decorative elements. The castle's seamstresses were required to create these garments without questioning their purpose, though many later reported feeling sick while working on projects they knew were destined for the king's chambers. But Ludwig's cruelty extended far beyond individual encounters. He began organizing what he called aesthetic evenings, gatherings where multiple young servants were required to perform for his entertainment and that of selected guests. These weren't formal events. There were no invitations, no official records, no witnesses outside of those forced to participate. The aesthetic evenings took place in a specially constructed chamber deep beneath the castle, accessible only through the network of secret passages that Ludwig had built into the structure during its construction. The room was designed like a theater, with tiered seating for observers and a raised platform where the performances took place. The walls were lined with mirrors, multiplying the images of whatever horrors occurred there, ensuring that every angle was visible to the audience above. During these gatherings, young servants were forced to enact scenarios that combined artistic themes with sexual violence. They might be required to recreate scenes from Wagner's operas, but with added elements of degradation and abuse. Or they would be made to pose as classical sculptures, holding positions for hours while guests examined them like art objects, sometimes touching and probing in ways that left permanent psychological scars. The king kept detailed records of these events, including sketches and written descriptions of his favorite moments. These documents, discovered after his death and immediately classified by the Bavarian government, reveal a mind that had completely lost touch with human decency. Ludwig wrote about his victims as if they were characters in a play, describing their pain and humiliation with the detached interest of a theater critic reviewing a performance. One particularly disturbing entry describes an evening where Ludwig forced a young stable boy named Klaus to recreate the myth of Ganymede, the beautiful youth abducted by Zeus. Klaus was made to wear wings crafted from real feathers and positioned on a platform that could be raised and lowered to simulate flight. For hours, while guests watched and commented, Klaus was subjected to treatment that left him bleeding and broken, all while Ludwig quoted passages from classical mythology as if the brutality was somehow elevated by its artistic context. Klaus lasted only 3 months at the castle before he suffered what court physicians diplomatically termed a nervous collapse. In reality, the young man had attempted to hang himself in his quarters, but was discovered by another servant before he could complete the act. Rather than receiving medical care, Klaus was quietly dismissed from service and sent away with enough money to ensure his silence. He died 6 months later in a mental asylum, never having recovered from his experience serving the king. The secret passages that Ludwig had built into Neuschwanstein weren't just for accessing servants' quarters. The entire castle was honeycombed with hidden corridors, concealed chambers, and observation posts that allowed the king to move through his domain like a phantom. He could appear in any room without warning, observe conversations from behind false walls, and retreat to private spaces when his public facade became too exhausting to maintain. These passages served multiple purposes beyond facilitating Ludwig's nocturnal predations. They allowed him to spy on his guests, listening to private conversations and gathering information that he could use to manipulate or blackmail those who might oppose him. They provided escape routes in case his activities were discovered by authorities. And they created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear throughout the castle, where no one could be certain they weren't being watched. The engineering required to create this hidden network was staggering. Ludwig employed the finest architects and craftsmen in Europe, paying enormous sums to ensure that his secret world remained hidden from public view. The construction costs for these passages alone exceeded the budget for many entire castles, contributing to the financial crisis that would eventually lead to his downfall. But the passages also reveal something else about Ludwig's psychological state, his complete disconnection from reality. He had created a physical environment that mirrored his mental condition, a maze of hidden spaces where nothing was as it appeared, where beauty masked horror, and where he could exercise absolute control over every aspect of human interaction. The servants who worked in the castle developed their own informal network of protection and warning. They created coded signals to alert each other when the king was prowling the passages, established buddy systems to ensure no one was ever completely alone with Ludwig, and maintained detailed records of his patterns and preferences in hopes of avoiding becoming his next victim. These survival strategies were shared through whispered conversations in the kitchens, written messages hidden in laundry bundles, and coded gestures that could convey danger without alerting the king's network of informants. The servants had, in effect, created their own resistance movement within the very walls of the castle, using the same techniques that prisoners of war might employ to protect themselves from their captors. But Ludwig's paranoia made even these precautions dangerous. He had installed listening devices in many of the servants' quarters, early versions of the surveillance technology that wouldn't become common for another century. Conversations that should have been private were often overheard, leading to dismissals, disappearances, and worse for those caught discussing the king's activities. The psychological impact on the castle's staff was devastating. Many developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, exhibiting symptoms like chronic insomnia, sudden fits of terror, and an inability to form normal relationships. The turnover rate among male servants was extraordinarily high, with most lasting only a few months before either fleeing in the night or suffering complete mental breakdown. Those who survived longer often did so by developing a kind of psychological splitting, creating mental compartments that allowed them to endure the king's abuse while preserving some fragment of their original identity. They learned to dissociate during traumatic encounters, to treat their own bodies as foreign objects that were being violated, rather than accepting that the violation was happening to them personally. This psychological defense mechanism, while protective in the short term, often led to long-term damage that manifested years later. Former servants of the castle were known throughout Bavaria for their inability to maintain normal lives, their tendency toward alcoholism and other destructive behaviors, and their mysterious reluctance to speak about their time in royal service. The king's activities weren't completely secret. Rumors had begun circulating throughout the Bavarian aristocracy about Ludwig's unusual preferences and the strange atmosphere at his castles. But speaking openly about royal improprieties was dangerous, and most nobles preferred to look the other way rather than risk their own positions by challenging the king's behavior. However, some documentation did survive, hidden in private letters and diplomatic correspondence. Foreign ambassadors reported concerns about Ludwig's mental state to their home governments, often using coded language to describe activities that couldn't be explicitly stated in official documents. These reports reveal a growing international awareness that something was seriously wrong with the Bavarian monarch. One particularly damning piece of evidence comes from a letter written by Prince Otto von Bismarck to Kaiser Wilhelm I, describing a diplomatic dinner at Neuschwanstein where Ludwig's behavior toward his male servants was so inappropriate that several guests left early. Bismarck wrote that the king conducted himself in a manner befitting a brothel master rather than a Christian monarch, and recommended that Prussia begin making contingency plans for Bavaria's eventual political instability. The financial costs of Ludwig's obsessions were staggering and ultimately unsustainable. Beyond the enormous expenses of castle construction and the secret passages, the king spent vast sums on costumes, furnishings, and equipment for his private chambers. He commissioned elaborate pieces of furniture designed specifically for sexual encounters, imported exotic fabrics and ornaments from across Europe, and maintained a staff of specialized craftsmen whose sole job was creating items for his personal use. More significantly, Ludwig's focus on his private obsessions led him to neglect the actual business of governing Bavaria. Important state decisions were delayed or ignored, while the king pursued his aesthetic interests. Tax collections suffered as Ludwig appointed incompetent officials based on their physical appearance rather than their qualifications. Military preparedness declined as defense budgets were diverted to fund castle construction and other royal projects. By 1885, Bavaria was facing a serious financial crisis, with mounting debts and declining revenues threatening the stability of the entire kingdom. Ludwig's ministers began pressing him to reduce expenses and focus on governing, but the king interpreted these suggestions as personal attacks on his lifestyle and responded with increasing paranoia and rage. It was during this period that Ludwig's behavior toward his servants became even more extreme and dangerous. The financial pressure and political criticism seemed to trigger something in his already unstable psyche, leading to acts of violence that went far beyond his previous cruelties. Johann Kratzer, a 16-year-old kitchen servant, became one of Ludwig's most tragic victims during this period. Johann had been working at the castle for only 2 weeks when he accidentally spilled wine on the king's robe during a private dinner. The punishment Ludwig devised for this minor mistake was so severe that it shocked even the jaded castle staff, who had witnessed years of royal brutality. Johann was taken to the underground chambers and subjected to a week-long ordeal that combined physical torture with psychological manipulation. He was forced to recreate the wine-spilling incident repeatedly, each time receiving increasingly severe punishment for his clumsiness. By the end of the week, Johann had lost his sanity completely, spending his remaining days at the castle in a catatonic state that no physician could treat. The boy's condition became a source of amusement for Ludwig, who would bring guests to observe Johann's vacant stare and unresponsive behavior. He would tell visitors that this was what happened to servants who displeased their king, using Johann's broken mind as both entertainment and warning to others who might consider defying royal authority. Johann died 3 months later, officially from a fever, but the other servants knew the truth. The king's cruelty had simply consumed the boy's will to live, leaving behind an empty shell that finally stopped functioning when it could no longer sustain the weight of its trauma. The incident with Johann marked a turning point in the castle staff's relationship with their king. Previously, many had tried to rationalize Ludwig's behavior as eccentric but harmless, or had convinced themselves that compliance would eventually lead to better treatment. Johann's fate made it clear that no amount of submission would protect them from the king's escalating madness. A small group of senior servants, led by the head butler Wilhelm Stark, began secretly documenting Ludwig's crimes and gathering evidence that might eventually be used to remove him from power. They kept detailed records of the king's activities, collected testimony from victims who were willing to speak, and began reaching out to government officials who might be sympathetic to their cause. This resistance movement was extremely dangerous, as discovery would certainly mean death for all involved. But the servants had reached a point where the risk of action seemed preferable to the certainty of continued suffering under Ludwig's rule. They developed elaborate codes and security protocols, met only in the deepest parts of the castle's wine cellars, and communicated through a network of trusted allies throughout the Bavarian government. Their efforts ultimately contributed to the events of June 1886, when a commission of psychiatrists declared Ludwig mentally incompetent and removed him from the throne. The official diagnosis was based on the king's financial irresponsibility and erratic public behavior. But the commission had also received detailed testimony about his treatment of castle servants, testimony that could never be made public due to its scandalous nature. Ludwig's reaction to his deposition was one of rage and desperation. He retreated to his private chambers and spent his final days burning documents, destroying evidence, and making increasingly frantic plans to escape Bavaria before he could be formally arrested. The servants reported hearing him talking to himself for hours, sometimes laughing maniacally, sometimes screaming threats against those who had betrayed him. When Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg on June 13, 1886, the official cause of death was listed as suicide by drowning. But what the public was never told was why he had been in such a hurry to escape that night. Because the commission hadn't just come to remove him from power, they had come to arrest him for crimes that would have shocked the civilized world. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming. Testimony from surviving victims, documentation of his experimental projects, physical evidence from the hidden chambers. It was enough to ensure that Ludwig would never see freedom again. And perhaps more importantly, it was enough to destroy Bavaria's reputation and potentially trigger international intervention. But Ludwig's death solved more problems than just removing a dangerous monarch. It allowed the government to seal away evidence that could have destabilized the entire region. The surviving victims were quietly relocated with generous pensions and strict confidentiality agreements. The hidden chambers were sealed and their contents destroyed. The experimental records were classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. And so the Mad King Ludwig became a romantic figure, the tragic artist who built fairy tale castles and died young. The tourism industry that grew up around his legacy carefully cultivated this sanitized version of history, emphasizing his architectural achievements while erasing any mention of the human cost. But here's what they couldn't erase: the descendants of his victims. Families who passed down stories through generations, always in whispers, always with the understanding that these truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. And occasionally, when renovation work is done on old buildings throughout Bavaria, workers still find things: hidden letters, concealed rooms, evidence of lives that vanished without explanation during Ludwig's reign. The fairy tale castle still draws millions of visitors each year, all of them admiring the beauty that Ludwig created. But if they knew what was hidden behind those ornate walls, if they understood the true cost of that architectural vision, would they still find it so enchanting? Or would they finally understand that some beauties are too tainted by horror to ever be truly appreciated? The truth about Ludwig II isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when absolute power meets unlimited depravity, and how easily society can be convinced to ignore systematic abuse when it's committed by someone whose public image they find appealing. The fact that his crimes have been so successfully hidden reminds us that even today, even in our supposedly transparent world, there are still powerful people whose worst actions remain buried beneath layers of respectability and careful image management. The secret passages of Neuschwanstein are sealed now, but they're still there, waiting, listening, remembering the voices of young men whose stories were deemed too inconvenient for history to preserve. And maybe, just maybe, one day someone will find the courage to unseal those chambers and let those voices finally be heard. Until that day comes, we can honor their memory by refusing to let their suffering be forgotten, by insisting that the truth about power and its victims be told, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us feel. What do you think about these hidden histories that powerful institutions work so hard to suppress? Have you ever wondered what other fairy tale figures from history might have darker secrets buried beneath their romantic legacies? Let me know in the comments below, and if this story opened your eyes to the hidden horrors behind beautiful facades, consider sharing it with others who might need to hear these forgotten truths. But the healing would take decades, and for many, it would never be complete. The psychological scars left by Ludwig's abuse ran too deep to be easily erased. Many former servants struggled with relationships for the rest of their lives, unable to trust authority figures or form intimate connections with others. Some turned to alcohol or other substances to numb the memories that haunted their dreams. Others simply withdrew from society entirely, living as hermits who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The official investigation into Ludwig's death was carefully limited to avoid uncovering information that might scandalize the royal family or damage Bavaria's reputation. Documents related to the king's private life were classified or destroyed, witness testimony was suppressed, and surviving servants were pressured to sign agreements preventing them from discussing their experiences publicly. This cover-up was largely successful in the short term. Within a few years, Ludwig had been transformed from a dangerous predator into a romantic figure, the mad king who built fairy tale castles and died tragically young. The tourism industry that grew up around Neuschwanstein and his other castles deliberately promoted this sanitized version of history, emphasizing Ludwig's artistic achievements while completely ignoring the human cost of his obsessions. But the truth has a way of surfacing despite official efforts to suppress it. Over the decades following Ludwig's death, historians began uncovering evidence of what really happened in those castle corridors. Private letters, hidden documents, and deathbed confessions gradually revealed the extent of the king's crimes and the suffering of his victims. The secret passages of Neuschwanstein still exist, though they're now sealed off from public access. Tourists who visit the castle today see only the beautiful reception rooms and artistic treasures, never imagining the horror chambers that lie hidden behind the ornate walls. The guides who lead tours through the castle are trained to speak only of Ludwig's architectural vision and cultural contributions, never mentioning the young men who died to satisfy his twisted appetites. But if you know where to look, evidence of the castle's dark past remains visible. Scratch marks on stone walls where victims tried to claw their way to freedom. Bloodstains that have soaked too deeply into wooden floors to be completely removed. Hidden panels that still slide open at the touch of a concealed lever, revealing glimpses of the passage network that once carried so much suffering. The tourist industry surrounding Ludwig II has created one of history's most successful rehabilitations of a criminal's reputation. Millions of visitors each year admire the king's castles, purchase souvenirs celebrating his artistic vision, and leave with the impression that he was a misunderstood genius rather than a sexual predator who destroyed countless lives. This transformation of Ludwig's legacy represents something deeply troubling about how society chooses to remember the past. We're willing to overlook almost any amount of human suffering if it's committed by someone whose other achievements we find aesthetically pleasing. We create beautiful myths about terrible people because the truth is too ugly to fit with our romantic notions about art and royalty. The young men who died in Ludwig's chambers have no monuments, no tourist attractions, no romantic legends built around their memories. Their names are forgotten, their stories suppressed, their suffering dismissed as irrelevant to the larger narrative of royal grandeur. They were erased twice, first by the king who killed them, then by a society that found their truth inconvenient. Perhaps most tragically, similar patterns of abuse continue today in institutions around the world. Powerful men still use their positions to exploit vulnerable young people, still hide their crimes behind elaborate facades of respectability, still count on society's willingness to look the other way when the truth becomes inconvenient. The secret passages of Neuschwanstein remind us that behind every beautiful facade, there may be hidden spaces where terrible things happen to people whose voices are never heard. The fairy tale castle is still standing, still drawing crowds who want to believe in the romance of absolute power. But the ghosts of Ludwig's victims haunt those corridors still, waiting for someone to finally tell their story and honor their memory. As you walk through those marble halls today, remember that beauty and horror often exist side by side, separated only by hidden doors and forgotten passages. Remember that the price of one man's artistic vision was paid by dozens of young lives that were cut short by cruelty and madness. And remember that the mad King Ludwig II wasn't mad in the romantic sense that history prefers to remember. He was simply evil. And evil has a way of hiding behind beauty until someone is brave enough to reveal what lies beneath the surface.